Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's Global Issues Through Literature, where we're going to discuss the book Go with Professor Kenley. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Veronica Dristis, and I am the Associate Director of the Global Studies Center. And for some of you might not know that our colleague Maya is no longer with the Global Studies Center. She's still here at Pitt, but has taken on a new job. So this evening you're stuck with me. And just a little patience. I'm a little rusty on the global issues through literature, though this was a program that I started when I was the outreach person back in 2007. So it has been going for a long time. But it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. I have been so fortunate, and many of you have to hear Dr. Kenley speak in different contexts. And so for those of you who do not know Dr. Kenley, let me introduce you. Dr. David Kenley is a remote professor at Dakota State University. He has a PhD in Chinese history and has published 4 books and numerous journal articles. Previously, he was at Elizabethtown College here in Pennsylvania and Marshall University in West Virginia. Dr. Kenley joined the Dakota State University community in 2020. He has a successful record of program innovation, international engagement, grant writing, online instruction, and many other critical areas of higher education. Recognizing these accomplishments, Dr. Kenley has been asked to speak and provide professional consultations throughout the U.S. and in many countries around the world. Dr. Kenley is fluent in Chinese and committed to the principles of diversity, equity, and international understanding. He and his wife live in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he is joining us now. Welcome, Dr. Kenley.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very nice introduction. Those introductions always sound so flattering until you realize I wrote it myself. So, I probably need to tone it down a little bit, but thank
It's
you.
perfect.
Well, I have interacted with at least a couple of you in the past, 3 of you at least, and it's good to see you again. I don't believe I've ever spoken with the Center for International Studies, though, before. I think this is my first experience doing so, and I'm thrilled to do it. I have many dear colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, and I've had some wonderful collaborative opportunities with them in the past. In fact, I was in Pittsburgh less than a week ago, so it would have been nice if we could have done this face to face, but it's also nice that this technology is available for us to do it remotely. So today I've been asked to speak a little bit about the historical context, the sociological context of the book that you've all read, the book Go. And we'll spend about an hour doing that. And then we've got some breakout sessions and some discussion groups. And we're going to also come back and talk a little bit about how can we integrate the lessons of Go into the classroom. And at that point, I really will be relying on you to engage and to carry that discussion along, because you are the professional K-12 educators. And to be honest with you, K-12 educators are much better educators than university professors anyway. I think we all know that. Especially those who take the time to attend events like these. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Just a second here to make sure I'm doing it right. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Zainichi in Japan. And you're familiar with that term, and you're familiar with, having read the book, you're familiar with some of the challenges and the issues of identity that they face in contemporary Japan. I want to start by just really taking a very long view perspective of Korean-Japanese relations. So clearly the image here is the 2 flags of Korea and Japan superimposed upon each other. And they have a very long and at times conflict-filled history. So we're going to look way back to pre-modern times, and we're going to do this very quickly because you don't need to know pre-modern Japanese-Korean relations to understand this book, only insofar as how they influence contemporary relations. 16th through the 19th century, the colonial era, and then we're really going to look at Koreans in post-war Japan right up till the present day. So Korea has long been a gateway, as we know, between China and Japan, and has played a very important role in bringing Chinese culture and traditions and language and literature to Japan. In fact, Japan's religion, politics, philosophy, language are all heavily indebted to Japan. And that's, and sometimes a hard debt for contemporary Japanese to recognize. For example, biologists and anthropologists have argued that both the Chinese and the Japanese come from a common ancestry and share similar DNA. And while that doesn't sound terribly controversial, it can be for many Japanese who think of themselves as a distinct race, separate from and perhaps superior to the Koreans. It wasn't until 2001 that the Japanese emperor made a statement and said, yes, the imperial household admits and recognizes that Japanese and Koreans share a similar genealogical ancestry and overlapping DNA. And that was a big deal. That was a big deal for the emperor to come out and make such an announcement. And not surprisingly, not everybody agreed with that announcement. As we move into the more modern era, relations between Japan and China remain difficult. In the late 16th century, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was one of the founders of the Tokugawa dynasty, launched a rather brutal invasion of Korea. And there's some discussion as to why he did this, whether it was to divert his troops who needed, some actions to engage in to keep them energized and excited about fighting, or what exactly was the cause of this. But we do know that it was a brutal, brutal war. As they went to war, Toyotomi said to his soldiers, "Mow down everyone universally without discriminating between young and old, men and women, clergy and the laity. High-ranking soldiers on the battlefield, that goes without saying, but also the hill folk, down to the poorest and meanest, and send their heads to Japan." So from the very beginning, this was intended to be an incredibly violent episode. And historians estimate that there may have been as many as 1 million casualties in this war, with the majority being Korean civilians. Well, Toyotomi says, bring their heads back to Japan, and that was not feasible or reasonable. So instead, they began cutting off the noses of the Korean casualties, their Korean victims, and brought their noses back to Japan. And today there's a memorial, the Mimizuka, or the ear mound, that is basically a pile of these Korean noses that have been returned to Japan. It's estimated there are about 38,000 noses within this hill. You're not mistaken. They call it the ear mound, but it's primarily noses that are contained therein. In addition to these noses, as many as 10,000 POWs were taken back to Japan to work as slaves in the 16th century. This ear mound, you're thinking, what does this have to do with Go? This ear mound is incredibly symbolic today. And while most Japanese know nothing about it, most Japanese will never visit it. In fact, it's not even maintained by any governmental entity. The local neighbors who live there in the area take turns mowing the lawn around it. Although for the Japanese, it's no big deal. For Koreans, it is extremely significant. And busloads of Korean tourists today make their way to the ear mound to visit it and to be reminded of the very tense relations between Japan and Korea. Things were always bad during the Tokugawa period. Japan was largely sealed off in terms of international trade. There were a couple minor exceptions. They did allow for the Dutch to trade in the city of Nagasaki, but the majority of the trade actually took place on Tsushima Island in the straits between Korea and Japan. And that was where Korean and Japanese traders would congregate on that island and facilitate a healthy level of trade that continued between the peninsula and the island throughout the Tokugawa era. But things are going to get bad again in 1895 with the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Well, let's go even back further. With the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War. The Sino-Japanese War was fought between China and Japan, but it really was over control of Korea. Who's going to be the dominant power? Who's going to be the dominant force in Korean politics? And for centuries, it had been China, and Japan was resentful of this. And war broke out in 1895. It went disastrously for the Chinese. They were defeated handily by their Japanese opponents. And as a result, Korea is going to become the dominant power, the dominant foreign power on the peninsula. Not everyone was happy with this. Not everyone was happy with the results of the Sino-Japanese War, including the Russians, who were also expanding dramatically into eastern Siberia and the Pacific, and had their own eyes on influencing Manchuria and Korea. And because of this emerging competition between Russia and Japan, war broke out again in 1905. And unlike the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese are going to win this war too. And this is a major blow to the Russian Empire, and really is what set in motion the fall of Tsarist Russia and the Communist Revolution. But unlike the Sino-Japanese War, this was not a quick, easy victory. It was very, very bloody. And historians of World War I, when they talk about trench warfare and the disastrous things that we saw in World War I, they oftentimes say, if we had just looked at what was going on in the Russo-Japanese War, we probably would have been better prepared for World War I and probably wouldn't have been so eager to rush into that fighting. Why do I say this? Well, once the Japanese won the Russo-Japanese War and solidified their control over Korea, Korea took on great significance in the Japanese imagination. This is where tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers had died to protect this peninsula. And therefore, it became, in effect, sacred ground that the Japanese had to control and maintain at all costs. It simply was land bought at a very high price that could not be forgotten. So it wasn't a surprise then that 5 years after the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese decided to simply annex Korea and make it a Korean colony. And it's going to remain a formal colony of Japan's for the next 35 years. That doesn't mean that the Koreans were happy with what was going on in their home country. In March of 1919, a large rebellion broke out against the Japanese, seeking for local Korean control over their own politics and economy and what have you. If you're familiar with Chinese history at all, this is 2 months, almost 2 months to the day, the same time as the May 4th movement, where anti-Japanese protests broke out in the case of China. So in the spring of 1919, the Japanese have plenty on their hands dealing with their Asian neighbors that are angry at Japan's activities. And this is an image showing some of the protesting and marching Koreans in that 1919 movement. Things are going to get worse before they get better for Japanese-Korean relations. In 1923, there's the Great Kanto earthquake that takes place in Japan. Devastating earthquake, kills, I should have that number on hand. I think it's close to 100,000 Japanese. It's very, very devastating. But it's not just the earthquake. Much like the San Francisco earthquake, the aftershocks, the fires, the irreparable damage to infrastructure was just as deadly as was the actual earthquake. I'm sorry, was there a question there? Okay, if not, that's all right. What does this have to do with Sino-Japanese relations or Chinese? What does this have to do with Korean-Japanese relations? In the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake, there were rumors spread that Korean immigrants living in Japan had taken advantage of this earthquake to engage in looting and theft and even the poisoning of drinking sources, water sources, that led to the death of many Japanese. These were rumors. There's no real evidence to suggest that there was wide-scale looting and no evidence to suggest that there was poisoning of drinking facilities. But what ends up happening is Japanese local citizens go on a rampage where they're looking for, tracking down, and killing their Korean neighbors, who they blame for the misfortune that Japan is suffering in 1923. It's truly a very, very dark period in Japanese-Korean relations where, where rumors led to terrible, terrible violence against unarmed and innocent civilians. It's also during this time, 1919 to 1940, that Japan institutes what they call their yen bloc. This is a plan to integrate their overseas colonies, especially Japan, or especially Korea, into China's home economy. In many ways, this was a classical colonial outpost metropole type relationship where Korea is expected to provide raw materials and unskilled labor to feed the burgeoning industrial factories of Japan and allow Japan's economy to flourish by extracting those resources from Korea. By 1940, 53% of Korea's arable land was owned by the Japanese. And because because many Koreans felt themselves economically disadvantaged within this yen bloc, they began emigrating to Japan in rather sizable numbers. You can see here from this chart, 1910 to 1915, not a whole lot of Koreans registered in Japan. 1925, 30, 35, 40, that number rises dramatically until, the eve of Pearl Harbor, there's as many as 1 million Koreans who have immigrated to Japan simply to enhance their economic opportunities because the Korean economy is being deindustrialized, so to speak, at the hands of Japanese colonial officials. Following the outbreak of World War II and the attack on Pearl Harbor and U.S. involvement in the war, Japan ratchets up that policy of economic integration under the title of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And I love this image here where it shows all these Asians marching together in peace and harmony towards a bright future. Of course, the Japanese are on the front row, and the Japanese really are the only ones wearing what we would call modern clothing. The rest are all wearing, their ethnic garb, showing their, showing the fact that they are locked into the past. The one exception is the one standing right next to Japan, and I believe that's the Thai flag on that man's shirt, if I'm not mistaken. Ironically, Thailand was not controlled by Japan and therefore was outside of this co-prosperity sphere. Someone, when we get to our Q&A portion here, if I've misread that flag or misinterpreted that image at all, please let me know. This co-prosperity sphere was really built on the widespread and aggressive extraction of resources, including labor. Koreans, for their part, were denied the opportunity to serve in the Japanese military, which was one path for upward social mobility. Instead, nearly 2 million Koreans were conscripted to serve in war-related industries, and most of those were within Japan. So these are people who are working in munitions factories, working to repair airports, harbors, different facilities that had been destroyed as a consequence of the war. So that's where this number spikes dramatically from about 1937 with the invasion of China. The number jumps dramatically. After the war, many of them are going to be repatriated, but somewhere around 600,000 to 700,000 are going to remain within Japan, even at the end of the war. So let's stop here for a second and make sure if I've gone too fast or any of this is not interesting to you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a minute because I just want to make sure I get a chance to answer any questions. I know you're all very busy and you may be in a home full of dirty dishes and kids and things. So if you want to keep your camera off, I get it. But if you're willing to turn your camera on, that would be awesome. It's a little easier to see and engage. Yes, Cindy.
David, I have a question. And didn't the Japanese government also send a lot of Koreans into Manchuria to settle that as kind of, settler colonialism?
Yeah, after Japan seized control of Manchuria, one of the reasons they seized control of Manchuria was the belief that Japan was becoming overpopulated and there wasn't enough resources, arable land for Japanese citizens. So they were supposed to be settling in Manchuria, but the numbers remained fairly small, smaller than the Japanese anticipated. When I say fairly small, I'm talking, I don't correct me on this. Do check me on this. I think it was somewhere between 1 and 2 million Japanese spent time in Manchuria during the war, which was not the numbers that was anticipated. So yeah, to control the area, some Koreans were moved there as well. Yeah, good question. Is there anything about this history that you didn't know? A lot of this is stuff that I know you teach. And the point of me linking all of these events together that you certainly already know is to kind of set the background for how Japanese Korean relations are influenced today. The ear mound is an excellent example when you have busloads of Koreans coming to visit it. All right, well,
David, I don't know if you saw Lori's comment in the chat earlier on, and she said, wow, it's ironic in the novel that, and apologies for pronunciation, Toyotomi Hideyoshi ended up being the Sugara's dad's professional boxer name.
yeah.
So I thought that was a good catch.
Yeah, very interesting. And surely that wasn't accidental. Although to be honest with you, I hadn't thought about why he would choose that name. That might be something good we can discuss in the discussion boards. Yeah, Lori.
I don't know. It was one of those things. I typed the comment. I was like, I know I saw that. But I did, but I had to look up the page. So I guess it said that, so it's on page 17 and yeah, a couple paragraphs down. And it said that the name was apparently decided by the gym's owner. So it was not a popular name among his Zainichi friends. And I got it wrong. They actually called him Hideyoshi, not Hideyoshi, Hideyoshi, or not Toyotomi Hideyoshi. It was Hideyoshi. But it said as in Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the 16th century ruler of Japan. Like that's just, it's too
So
much.
that was a name given to him by the gym owner who was Japanese. Interesting. Good catch. Well, if there's no other questions, let me continue on, but don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have questions. Okay, well, let's jump into the modern era here. See if I can get this going. Koreans in post-war Japan. I think it's important, well, first of all, we're familiar with the term Zainichi. If anyone reads kanji there, those characters pronounced Zainichi literally means existing in Japan, or those who are living in Japan, those who are in Japan. It has no Korean reference whatsoever, but through context and through usage, it has come to mean clearly that the Koreans that are living in Japan, primarily or almost exclusively those who are a remnant of the World War II era. So if you have, say, for example, a Korean foreign exchange student who comes and lives in Japan today, they would likely not be referred to as Zainichi, despite the fact that they are existing in Japan. So yeah, just this chart again, I'll pull this up a couple more times so you can see the numbers we're talking about here. It's not a small amount. And for most of the post-war period, it's going to remain somewhat constant. They were, throughout this period, they were considered foreigners. And they had to carry an identification card with them at all times. And there's a scene in the book, if I'm remembering correctly, where a police officer stopped him and asked him to see his ID card. They also had to be fingerprinted at the local police station, which in Japan, much like here in the United States, to be fingerprinted has the connotation of being a criminal. So these are people who are in many ways criminalized just for the fact that they exist in Japan. It wasn't until 1993 that these Zainichi were granted special permanent residence status, which meant that they no longer had to be fingerprinted. They still were not citizens of Japan, but at least they were no longer required to go through the humiliating experience of being fingerprinted. Now, not all Zainichi in Japan are the same. There were really two main groups that evolved in the post-war period. The first is known as the Mindan group. And while it's hard to make clear differentiations between the two in every context, by and large, the Mindan were more closely affiliated with South Korea. They formed their own newspapers. They formed their own schools. But by and large, the Mindan was much less politically influential within the Zainichi community. They eventually came to represent perhaps the majority of those in Japan, but a less vocal majority. By contrast, Chongryon was the pro-North faction. And they, perhaps because North Korea is not recognized by Japan, or was not recognized by Japan for most of this period, they were really stateless in many ways. And the Chongryon group was opposed to assimilation, was in favor of perpetuating Koreanness and Korean identity. They too built schools and newspapers, far more schools, perhaps as many as 140 by the 1970s. They provided legal and financial and social support to the Zainichi in Japan. They were extremely active. So what are some of the challenges that these Zainichi faced? And when we're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they had many challenges throughout the post-war period. For one, they had lower education levels. And this could be that they lived in poorer neighborhoods, had less access to high-quality schools. It could also be because so many of them attended these Korean language schools that, while it promoted bilingualism, they did not have the intense focus on Japanese language, Japanese history, and the other subjects necessary to pass the college entrance exams. So they attend university at much lower levels than their Japanese counterparts. They also face significant and serious job discrimination, both legal and illegal. The Zainichi oftentimes were employed in what's known as the 3D industries, those industries that are dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. So a lot of restaurants as service workers, a lot of construction laborers, and ironically, through the 1970s and 80s, they almost completely controlled the pachinko industry in Japan, and made large amounts of money controlling pachinko parlors, which oftentimes was then sent back to relatives in Korea as a form of remittances. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, pachinko is not as popular today as it was a generation or two ago, so that is declining in importance. They faced housing discrimination, oftentimes denied housing loans and denied access to more privileged neighborhoods. So instead, they did what a lot of discriminated immigrant groups do. They created their own ethnic neighborhoods. There are two very sizable Korea towns in Japan, primarily in Osaka. Koreatown in Osaka has about 90,000 people living in it. Most of those clearly Zainichi. And in Tokyo, Koreatown had about 80,000 residents. They face marriage discrimination, which shouldn't be a surprise because you've read the book. There are stories of parents hiring private investigators to investigate the ethnic background of their prospective future son-in-law or daughter-in-law to ensure that they were not Zainichi, that were seeking to pass as Japanese. And clearly, as we saw in the book, this was a cultural hurdle that was simply too large to overcome for both the Koreans and the Japanese, which led to, for most of the post-war period, marriage within their own group. That's changing, and that's changing quite dramatically in the 20th century, but there are still stories of parents in-laws that worry that their son or daughter-in-law may actually be Korean. Here's a chart showing some of the marriage of Koreans in Japan. So this is Koreans who marry Japanese husbands, is in green. Koreans who marry Japanese wives is in red. And those that marry both Koreans marrying Koreans in blue. And as you can see, in 1965, it was the vast majority of those who were getting married were marrying within their own Zainichi community. But those numbers are changing. And I find it kind of interesting that Japanese men seem to be more willing to consider marrying a Korean woman than Japanese women are willing to marry a Korean man. Again, that may be the influence of patriarchal society in which the in-laws play a significant role in these wedding decisions. They suffer from public criticism, violence at times, being denounced and being ridiculed in the public in various ways. And this is problematic. This is a sign, I think this is from a protest of about 10 or 11 years ago. A man in a Japanese ultra-nationalist demonstration holds a sign stating, "Put the trash in the trash can. Send Koreans back to the Korean peninsula." A clear reference to suggest that Zainichi in Japan are like the trash, and the trash needs to be taken out. I'm going to try to share this video with you for a minute. This is a large-scale anti-Zainichi protest of about a decade ago, and you can see some of the heated feelings and emotions that are boiling over at this protest. Stop share, try to reshare and see if it works. Okay, can you see that? I'll assume your silence means you can. Let me stop here for just a minute. What you've got going on here on the opposite side of the street are people who are protesting against the existence of the Zainichi and asking them to, be deported and sent out of Japan. On this side of the street, closest to us, is a counter protest going on against the protesters on the other side of the street, accusing them of being racists, accusing them of being anti-modern. So I wouldn't, I don't want to suggest that all Japanese are rabid anti-Zainichi people. Indeed, there are many who are embarrassed by the legacy of Japan's interactions with Korea. But as you'll watch, I'll press the play button here again. As you'll watch, there are some very vocal people on our closest side of the street, but most of them are kind of just gathering around to watch to see what's going on. So what are some of the things you noticed about that short little protest? Anything jump out at you? Not a short little protest. It was a big protest. We watched a short little clip about the protest.
I have a question. Sandy made a comment about it's the Ai Weiwei, how you say that? Salute. I am not familiar with this phrase. Could you fill me in? I see smiles already, but maybe other
It's
people.
simply flipping the bird.
I was going to
but
say, David, if you don't want to do it, I'd do it, but you already did it.
Well, I
Will
mean,
be.
obviously, but why is it called the Ai Weiwei salute?
Ai
It's not. I
Weiwei
just made that up.
Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist who has employed that
Gesture.
gesture in several of his artwork, in many of his artwork. Yeah.
So it kind of so it's kind of become named after him then.
So I was wondering if anybody, I don't know that that's widely named after him, no, but I was wondering if anyone noticed that a lot of flipping the bird.
I was surprised to see that. I didn't realize they had adopted a more Western gesture for that.
And a lot of the chants were English. I don't know if you noticed. Racists go home, racists go home. Which makes you wonder who's the intended audience to hear these chants. What did you notice about, what else did you notice? What did you notice about the people that were anti-Zainichi on the other side of the street? Did anything stand out to you?
They were carrying the flag of Imperial Japan, weren't they?
They were. They were carrying Japan's wartime flag with strong connotations with World War II. It would perhaps be the equivalent of carrying a Nazi flag in a protest like this, which, as we all know, happens in American protests.
Well, I just have a quick question. I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly or not, but Korea was still being occupied by Japan too during World War II, right? It wasn't until after, yeah.
Yeah, correct. That's correct. Okay, let me see if I can get back to my screen here. Here we go. So a lot of this is quite embarrassing to the Japanese community. This was a bill, and I don't have the date here, but I think it was about I think it was about 2015. Japan passes anti-hate speech law as Koreans, as Zainichi, are increasingly targeted by racism. The bill is mostly a response to the rising number of anti-Korean rallies being held in the country. So while intermarriage is becoming more common, while Zainichi schools, Korean language schools, are on the decline, while more and more Zainichi are applying for Japanese citizenship, nevertheless, these anti-Zainichi rallies have been on the increase over the last 20 years, which seems to be kind of counterintuitive and deserves some thought, I think. So one of the ways that the Koreans deal with these challenges, the Zainichi deal with these challenges, is by attempting to pass as Japanese. And that's what happens in the book, right? The young man does not actively go out of his way to hide. Well, in some cases, he does hide his Zainichi background, but people see him and kind of assume he's Japanese, and rather than correct him, he goes along with that. So check my notes here real quickly. Recently, between 9,000 and 11,000 Koreans in Japan naturalize each year. This is still a small fraction of the nearly 600,000 Koreans living there. And Japanese and South Korean nationality laws do not permit adults to hold multiple citizenships. You can't hold two passports. So if someone decides that they want to become a Japanese citizenship, it requires that they surrender their Korean citizenship. Most at this time also take on Japanese names and, in effect, completely surrender their identity as Korean Japanese. I want to come back and talk about passing in a little bit later. So I've got a few quotes here from graduate students of the Chosen Soren school system. These are students who have, Zainichi students who have been Korean educated within Japan. And how is it that they identify? How is it that they see themselves as Zainichi in Japan? This person says, North Korea is my country, says Mr. Shin, 25, a Korean university graduate and resident of Aichi Prefecture, who has spent his whole life in Japan. As a 25-year-old, obviously he was born and raised in Japan. His father was probably born and raised in Japan. But, he adds, I'm North Korean. I think how you understand yourself entirely changes your life. So he doesn't simply describe himself as Korean, but as North Korean. Jongwon Kwong, 33, originally from Nagoya, but now working in an English school in Chiba, says he identifies more with South Korea, despite having been through the Chongnyeon education system. The school made me proud to be Korean, but it's easier to be Japanese. And actually, I'd rather be South Korean. I used to think I was unique, but it's complicated to talk about because the image of Koreans here is sometimes negative. So this young man is not only struggling with his identity as either a Korean or a Japanese, but also whether he's South Korean or North Korean. When his family moved to Japan, there was no South Korea and North Korea. So he's having to choose between multiple identities here. Like many Chongnyeon high school students, Ka-sung Kang visited North Korea on a school trip. The funny thing is that we wouldn't want to live there, but it was good to be in our homeland, says Kang, who works in Tokyo as a translator. When I visited South Korea, it didn't feel like home. I'm not North Korean, but I'm a North Korean in Japan, a Zainichi. Ms. Chin, a schoolmate of Kong, also living in Tokyo, agrees. Quote, North Korea is my country, but I'm lucky that I was born in Japan. Which team would I cheer for if I watched a soccer game between North Korea and Japan? It's hard to answer that. So Oh, here's one more. Kong feels an allegiance to North Korea, but growing up in a society hostile to the North and traveling abroad has left her with a complex view of the land she visited 14 years ago. Quote, I used to be more communistic, but I've traveled abroad and heard other opinions, so I'm not communist anymore, she says. We don't need to study socialist ideology, but on the other hand, if North Korea becomes capitalist, then what does North Korea mean? I'm not sure. It's ridiculous studying the ideology of Kim Jong-il, but at the same time, Japan teaches its own ideology in school. I love these quotes because they really highlight the choices that these Zainichi have to make, or that society forces them to make. Are they South Korean? Are they North Korean? Are they Japanese? And for many of them, they don't have clear and simple answers for that themselves. Here's the statistic I shared with you earlier about Japanese becoming naturalized citizens. There is no notion of Korean Japanese. You're either Korean or you're Japanese. You can't be both. So, how are we doing on time-wise here? I think we're doing okay. In the 20th century, pop culture has played a large role in changing many of these attitudes and assumptions about Korea and the Zainichi. Japanese television dramas have helped to underpin and reinforce a myth of the homogeneity of the Japanese people. So the idea is that there are no minorities, there are no non-Japanese. And throughout most of the post-war period, pop culture has reinforced that mistaken belief. And yet, more recently, there have been some contrasting attitudes, some contrasting viewpoints. For example, here are 3 films that came out in the last generation. The first one, Dear Pyongyang. It's set in the 1970s, where a Zainichi father decides he's going to send his 3 sons back to North Korea to reconnect with their cultural roots. His daughter, however, remains with him in Japan, and they continue to send letters and care packages to their sons in North Korea. Over time, the sons become increasingly dependent upon these care packages sent from Japan. And at one point, the daughter is allowed to go visit her brothers. But the whole experience forces the father to rethink his own assumptions about North Korea and what it means to be Zainichi in Japan. Second film here is Linda, 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 and I'm a little hesitant to use this, but it's a very fun film and it's very appropriate for high school students, so I think that they would enjoy it. It's about a girl band that is preparing for the school talent show, and at the last minute, one of their band members drops out. And so they turn to a Korean exchange student living in Japan and invite her to be part of the band. And it's a heartwarming, feel-good story about how these Japanese and Koreans work together to achieve their dreams and goals of becoming rock stars. My hesitancy with that is it's a Korean study abroad student, which, as I pointed out earlier, probably doesn't really fit the title of Zainichi. But nevertheless, it does represent positive relations between Japan and Korea. And then, of course, Go, which you just read, which has been turned into a film that you could use to supplement with the book if you so choose to do so. There have been some notable Zainichi hyperachievers in Japan, which has helped change attitudes among the Japanese public. Arina Mizusawa, here on the left, as you can see, has taken a Japanese name. She's a model and an actress, which has changed, and she's been successful in changing a lot of people's opinions. The middle here is a guy who's taken the stage name Verbal. He's a rapper, a Zainichi rapper, raps in Japanese. And on the right is Rise Kwan, who has kept her Korean name. She was a very popular singer who about 5 years ago, I believe, was killed in a car accident or committed suicide. I can't remember. I should have double checked on that before we came into this meeting, but a very sad, tragic story of a up and coming promising Zainichi star in Japan. Another good thing has been the Korean wave. The idea that popular culture produced in Korea is now becoming fashionable in Japan. In 2003, this love story drama became very popular in Japan. It's called Winter Sonata. Winter Sonata. It starred the Korean actor Bae Yong-joon. He played the role of a talented architect and a passionate ladies' man. This show, as I said, became very popular in Japan and enhanced people-to-people relations between the two countries. Unfortunately, it did not necessarily lead to dramatically improved relations in attitudes towards the Zainichi. And in fact, there was some pushback against this series because the Korean star of this was just the perfect man. And many Japanese wives were saying to their husbands, why can't you be more like Bae Yong-joon? And the husbands were like, forget him. He's Korean. This is a movie. But apparently it had some impact on marital relations in the case of Japan. So I think we've been going almost an hour now, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, pretty close. I wanted to stop and ask some questions here, answer any questions that people might have. Then, if I'm not mistaken, did we lose our host? Oh, there she is. Veronica, at this point, we're going to stop and answer some questions for a little bit, and then we break into study groups. Is that right? Or discussion groups? Maybe Veronica has to take a break. Questions. What questions do you have? How many of you have traveled to Japan? Any exposure to the Zainichi there that you were aware of, Cindy?
No, not at all.
I have a quick question.
Probably that you weren't aware of. I'm guessing you would
Aware at
had
all.
a Zainichi server in a
Mhm.
restaurant at some point that spoke completely fluent Japanese, and you had no idea they were Zainichi.
Yeah, no idea.
Yes, Sandy.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just had a thought while you were talking. The Korean schools, high schools, and universities that they built, the teachers in the, did they bring them from North Korea, or were they also Zainichi who became the teachers?
They were almost all Zainichi, but they
Okay.
were financially supported by the North Korean government. Korea
Okay.
invested heavily in supporting Zainichi education, Zainichi culture, newspapers, cultural exchange, well into the 1990s when North Korea started having some of their own financial issues, and it became more difficult to support these institutions at the level that they had previously been doing.
Yeah, that like the one lady whose quote you read, she was saying when she traveled abroad, she found out that like the rest of the world is not as fond of North Korea. And that's why I thought, do they send teachers over like for their own propaganda purposes?
Yeah, no, most of them were born and raised in Japan and deeply committed to that North Korean identity, that communist identity.
That part really surprised me, I have to admit. I could much better understand them, identifying with South Korea. And I guess just in terms of, a technologically advanced society and, all the popular culture that comes out of South Korea and so forth. And so I thought those quotes were great, but I really was surprised, this sense of North Korean identity, and it being so very separate from South Korean identity. That really caught me off guard.
So the majority of Zainichi would probably identify as being more pro-South Korea, but that pro-North Korea portion is much, much more influential. Educationally, culturally, politically, they have invested a lot more into maintaining the Zainichi identity. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? And sometimes you wonder, why would they identify with North Korea, a country they've never been to, other than it's the most clearly anti-Japanese form of Korean identity, right? Is it really pro-North Korea? Is it somewhat thumbing your nose at Japan? Or a little of both?
Hi, I'm Marcy. I wrote a question down about North Korean schools in Japan. Like, are they accredited? Like, are they just like, do they are they accredited through North Korea, or do they have curriculum connections with North Korea? Once you graduate and have a certificate or diploma, like, how well recognized is it?
They are considered inferior schools. Most definitely considered inferior, underfunded teachers that are not as well trained and not as well prepared. But I do think several of them are accredited in terms of people recognizing their diplomas as being valid. The biggest challenge is, that you spend so much time on emphasizing that North Korean identity and the North Korean language and things like that. It takes time away from biology and mathematics and Japanese language studies. So as you all know, there's only so many hours in a day, and what you choose to emphasize is going to have ramifications for your students.
I was wondering, you talked about the uprise in anti-Zainichi protests in Japan. Is that coinciding with economic downturns there?
That's a safe assumption, yeah. Although Japan has been pretty much in an economic downturn since 1989.
Right.
But yes, I think most of those, at the risk of getting too far into the weeds here, I think most of those who are participating in anti-Zainichi rallies would fit into Hillary Clinton's so-called basket of deplorables. People who are maybe economically and educationally disadvantaged and are feeling left behind by their own economy and their own culture, and therefore are lashing out at others. Okay, Veronica, what's next on our agenda?
Sorry, couldn't find the unmute button on all the things I have open to make sure. We still have a little bit of time for Q&A.